Hello, everyone. Welcome to this Talks at Google virtual event. My name is Parvathy, and I'm on the Global Product Solutions team at Google, focusing on responsibility mechanisms across our ads platforms. Today, I am so excited to introduce our guest, Dr. Aarathi Prasad. Dr. Aarathi was born in London and educated in the West Indies and the UK. After completing a PhD in molecular genetics from Imperial College London, she later trained in bioarchaeology. Dr. Prasad is an Honorary Research Fellow at the University College London's Department of Genetics, Evolution and Environment. She is also the author of 2 other books published in the UK, and most recently, the book that we will be discussing today, Silk, A World History, which you should be sure to get anywhere books are sold. But without further ado, Dr. Aarathi, it's my pleasure to welcome you to Talks at Google.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here.
We're so excited to have you. So we can go ahead and get started. Dr. Prasad, one of the main themes that is woven throughout your book, Silk, is the fact that silk has ancient roots and it's truly global, despite, Chinese silk being potentially the most popular or the most well-known. Can you walk us through your journey for how you got started diving into this global research?
I'm quite embarrassed to say I actually also at the beginning thought there was only one type of silk, and I spent a lot of time in India. My mother's from Bangalore, and there's people wear silk a lot, beautiful silk. There's one called Kanchivaram, and it's beautiful bright colors interwoven with metal strands. Very skilled work. I saw people weaving it as a child, and I didn't actually know there was anything more than that. But as I started researching the book, I went to the Natural History Museum because I was really interested in how the silk was made. So that means looking at the metamorphosis of the silk moth. And then I got there and there were all these other silk moths from all over the world. And I realized that there were 133 insect families that and it's not just moths that create the silk. A lot of insects actually create silk threads as well for various purposes. But yeah, I got to this museum and there were samples of moths from everywhere from Greece to Iraq, Albania, Madagascar, Turkey, Mozambique. And none of these were domesticated as the Chinese silk moth had been. It's still an amazing story. The Chinese silk moth is an amazing story because it is the world's only domesticated insect, and it was domesticated and bred somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 years ago by Neolithic farmers in China, because its ancestor had very beautiful, very fine, very white silk. But that ancestor was also considered a pest to farmers. And so they bred it over the millennia. And it became, as breeding does, a very pale, it lost its camouflage. It couldn't fly. They're born blind. They're completely dependent
Wow.
on humans for to be fed, but also to mate. So they can't live really without us. And all of that was in the service of producing this material. But yeah, across the world, there are all these other moths that also created silk, that also people had used. And I think the larger point to me, not just from this book, but my last book, which was about how people approach health and disease in India with the diversity of ways in which that can be done with modern medicine and with traditional, so-called traditional systems. I think we live in a world where we have imbalanced ideas of where knowledge is created, what innovation is, and who innovates. But that it quickly became clear to me that silk is one great example that illustrates that the knowledge and use of silk is a global story. Because anywhere in the world where people saw an animal doing something like this, making a web of silk or a cocoon of silk, why wouldn't they use it? And so, I discovered things I wouldn't have realized that on the African continent there were people in many countries who made silk of wild moths. And one of them in Madagascar is a wild moth that they made shrouds for the dead out of, But what's really fascinating is this silk from that moth is very famous for being rot proof. So people knew exactly what they were doing. And yeah, it was a global pursuit.
Wow, that's incredible. And you actually brought this point about just the vast amount of other animals other than the silkworms that are involved. I was also totally surprised. I knew that spiders were involved to some extent, but I didn't quite have an idea of this entire ecosystem. So, can you tell us more about this research process for actually um, researching the entire ecosystem of animals? I know there's mollusks, shrimp. You mentioned different types of moths. Walk us through that.
I I read a lot. I looked around a lot, but also I spoke to people, and I particularly spoke to women who wove because it's really interesting when you speak to people who actually work with materials. The Pinna nobilis is a Mediterranean mosque. It's very bizarre. It can be about a meter tall, about 3 feet, I guess. And it's now critically endangered, but it had been used throughout history in ancient times to make a fabric, a silk fabric. It's called sea silk. It's not the same protein structure as spider and moth silk. Spiders and moth make a very similar, very repetitive structure that gives it incredible strength and elasticity. But this Pinna nobilis, it's very interesting because it silk has the property of being self-healing. And yeah, and it lives under the Mediterranean Sea. And so I spoke to, I went to Sardinia where there are women who still work with weaving the silk. They can't use the silk from this animal now. They can't take it from the sea because it's critically endangered because of anthropogenic change, pollution of waters, the heating sea. It's very sad. But they have historic collections of silk that they still weave. And it was actually very difficult to find out whether, well, as a scientist, you want solid evidence that this was
Sure.
used in ancient times, but cloth doesn't preserve very, very rarely. And we're talking about Bronze Age, the Minoan civilizations, Crete and Knossos, um, and ancient Egypt, Libya, the Romans. So I spoke to these weavers, and these women said, I said, if you saw this giant mollusk being fished from the sea, because people fished it to eat the flesh inside the protein, tasted very bad. The Romans said that it was a diuretic, so it probably wasn't very pleasant either. But it has these long threads at its foot, and they can be long as a kind of a bob haircut, 3 times finer than human hair, golden bronze in color. And they said, yeah, if I saw that and it was in a fisherman's boat, of course I would weave it. Um, and I said, but it's so fine. People say it's very difficult. And they said, well, all fabrics are difficult, or everything that we work with has its own character and personality, but you have to respect the material for what it is. And spider silk's really interesting because spider silk, it's kind of been the holy grail for scientists since the 17th century or so, particularly in Europe. And as European colonialism started spreading throughout the world, and lots of animals kept being sent back dead normally to Europe to be studied, they realized that there were these giant spiders across the world that made huge webs. So some of them are suspended on twine-like wires, part of the web that goes 26 feet across. So you can't really miss them. And it's the holy grail of silks because it's incredibly strong. Moth silk's strong, but spider silk is incredible. It is said that if a spider was the size of a human being, then the web it makes will be strong enough to stop a jetliner in its path. So
Wow.
um, so there's been all sorts of attempts to extract silk from spiders. I told you that the Chinese moth was domesticated, and
Yes.
it's become really docile. Spiders don't like being they don't like
No, they
cooperating.
don't.
So over the years in different places and independently, people created little contraptions to pull the silk directly out of the spider. They tickle their stomach and their abdomen and pull the thread out, and they were immobilized on these contraptions that were quite awful, but it wouldn't kill them. They'd go away very unhappy. But it's the real problem with spider silk is it's never been possible to get enough of it. And so, in the last decades, people have tried really strange things, but, clever things. There's a professor who was emeritus, he was at Utah State University, Randy Lewis, and his lab genetically modified E. coli bacteria, which replicates very quickly. So anything that you put into them, they make a lot of very quickly. Then he made yeast as well, the kind similar to the kind of yeast we make beer out of. And then he made a goat, which when you milk it, the spider silk comes out in the milk. And now there are labs using Bombyx mori, the Chinese silk moth, because he said, well, they're really good at making silk. But what happens is when you genetically modify these animals, you take not the whole spider silk, you take a part of it, and you put it in. So it's not really spider silk. And I've developed a lot of respect for these little animals we don't really look twice at, because it's not just about the composition of the silk that makes it so strong. It's the spiders have many glands, and each gland extrudes a different type of silk for a different purpose. They wrap their eggs in it, they make webs with it, they wrap prey in it, and they drop from it. So each type has to have different properties, and that happens when the protein comes out of the spider. So if it's not coming out of the spider, it's not going to be exactly right. But there are also other organisms like that little shrimp. There's a little shrimp, and it spins a thread actually, which is midway in strength and elasticity between spider silk and the kind of cement that barnacles use to affix themselves to the hulls of ships. And so scientists and engineers have been looking to emulate that. This is an adhesive that works underwater. The pinna nobilis is self-healing. The spider silk is incredibly strong. That hasn't escaped the notice of people throughout history who've been trying to make things like body armor, for example, out of it.
Wow, that's fascinating. And I actually hadn't even planned on asking this question, but as you were talking, I was just thinking, how long did it actually take you to get to a place where you felt like you had explored, because to your point, there's still so much more out there to research, and it's really so complex. How long did it take you to feel like you were in a place where you could actually write a full story about this entire ecosystem?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was already writing too much. I'm fascinated by the fabric. It's beautiful, but I think to me, I entered this topic because at the time I was writing co-authoring a paper for a medical journal on stem cells and regenerative medicine, and it's the reason I studied genetics as well. It's because I thought this is a material it's an animal protein, and it can be used in the body to encourage the body to heal itself. There were a lot of medical and technological innovations coming out of it. So as I started finding these different animals that had been being used by the American military, by researchers in various fields, for medical, surgical applications. For example, the pinna nobilis, because it's self-healing, it's been used, it's been trialed for use in fetal surgery, for example. So I kind of I started like that, but then I fell down this rabbit hole of learning about the actual animals and the natural history and the biology, which is really incredible. But also, I think for me, studying science, I never learned about the scientists. I learned about, we learn about things that are named after people, but we don't know who they are. We don't know what drove them, and we don't know the context in which that science was created. And with a lot of this science that came out of a particular period of discovery or European discovery of the world, there was a lot of extractiveness in where the knowledge came from and then where it was applied, what was taken and how it was taken. And so I think it's really important to understand how science developed. And so I also fell down that hole of wanting to understand what the context was at that time and why people were so passionate that some scientists sacrificed their eyesight,
Yeah.
for studying this material.
So let's go into that rabbit hole actually, because it's an interesting one. One of the many interesting facts that your book brings to life is the role of women. And I loved how you mentioned earlier, we have sort of a disbalanced notion of who does the research and how. And as I was reading, I actually found myself totally enthralled by the unique stories that you capture of certain women. When or how did you start to see a trend in the role of women and silk?
That's a really interesting question. I think one of the ways that I discovered that there are many silks is because I was reading the papers of a scientist at Harvard, an archaeologist actually. She was an archaeologist and a textile expert called Dr. Irene Good, and she made a really interesting point. She said if you are in China and you find an archaeological site and you find a textile, you're going to try and see if that's silk. But if you found it in Mexico or Madagascar or India from the same period, you're not, because that's not where silk was supposed to come from. And so this woman opened up my eyes to the diversity and the different perspectives, just different perspectives to look at things in a different way. And as I started researching the animals, the natural history and the biology, it's not that it's that women did as much research and science as men did. It's just that we don't know about them, and their records are kind of wiped because, for example, in the UK, there's a 17th century scientific society called the Royal Society, and that didn't admit women until 1948. And so one of the characters that I mentioned, Maria Sibylla Marianne, she was a 17th century. She was called a flower painter. She was German, lived in Amsterdam, and she was known as a flower painter. But she was in her 50s when she got on a ship to Suriname from Amsterdam. From the age of 13, she'd been studying metamorphosis. And the reason she had been able to do that, well, she found insects that metamorphosized and studied them. She had study journals from the time she was essentially a child, but also because there was a silk industry in Germany. And I think her uncle was involved in that. So these domesticated silk moths became really important to science because they were so docile. They were a great model for experimentation and research. And so she, I believe, probably made the first sort of scientific journey of discovery. Keep in mind that Darwin, other scientists were either sailors, they were captains, they were wealthy men, they were doctors, or they were military men. And they were on ships and they did some science because they had access to the world. She got on a ship with her younger daughter for the express purpose of going to South America to look at animals in the wild, because she said, all these animals are coming back pinned to boards. They're dead. I don't know what they look like in life. I don't know if they're male or female. I don't know if what plants they eat and how they live. And so she's considered the mother of ecology because she took this wider perspective of it. But it's really interesting because she was a woman, when she went to South America, to Suriname, which was a Dutch colony, was able to speak. Women spoke to her. So women spoke to her, and they probably wouldn't speak to men or people who identify as or said we're here to do research. And those researchers probably wouldn't speak to them. And I'm talking about enslaved African people. I'm talking about indigenous native Surinamese women who would tell her things like, this flower, we use it to have abortions. And she would write, you can't treat people like this because that life is so cruel to them that they prefer to have abortions than to give birth to children who will end up being enslaved. But one key point about this is so much of the knowledge of nature came from the knowledge of indigenous people, because if you land in a new country, how do you know what the plants and animals are and what values they have? You ask people, and those people were scientists and natural historians in their own right. So she got quite ill while she was there, but she had recorded many wonderful insects, including one wild moth. The wild moths are also the ones you get in India, and these were found by Irene Good, the archaeologist I mentioned, in in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, there's some beads, and those beads come from the Indus Valley civilization. And there were um, silk threads inside of them from 3 or 4 distinct species of wild moths that are still used in India to this day. And that was contemporaneous with the development of Chinese silk. So I think there were other silk roads, and that wasn't the only one. It's just that we don't know what they are. But yes, so these wild silk moths are huge. They're about the size of your hands, and they're brightly colored. And she described one in South America that had they look like little glass windows on their wings, extremely beautiful. And she wrote back to Holland that they spin a strong thread that made me think it would be good silk. She gathered some and sent it to Holland. And remember, she embroidered with silk. She worked with materials. She was a woman who did handicrafts. So these women really felt and understood the material, and so she was flagging that for profit. But she got ill while she was there. She went back to Suriname. She wrote this amazing book. I have a copy because I wrote this book during lockdown, so I couldn't go to libraries. It's an enormous book with beautiful paintings. And that was all insects and wildlife from Suriname. And in order to write that, she took a woman back with her. So there was an indigenous South Surinamese woman who got on the ship and went back to Holland and co-authored this book, but we have no idea who she is because she was never named. So there were not only the European women were ignored, kept out of science, and they used her records, by the way, but she was never allowed into the academy. But there were also indigenous people who contributed to this, who were women, who we don't really know about. So many women. There's so many. There's another woman who was born in India to a British military family. And during lockdown, I found that her notes and her drawings from India, again, she worked with Indian painters. We don't know who they were, but they made the paintings in her book. She did as well, but she had these scientific notes. And in the Natural History Museum in London, they used a lot of her notes to catalogue species because those curators didn't go to India. She was there. So I wrote to the librarians and I said, can you access her book for me? And they said 3 or 4 emails to different curators, and they all emailed me and said, we can't find it. I said, but you've used her records to name things that we don't know where this book is. And the only place I found it was in an auction house, a famous auction house. It had been sold in 2016, and a botanist said to me, he said, oh no, he said, I think what's happened is they've bought the book, they've torn out the beautiful pictures, sold it, and thrown her notes away. So like in this way, there were so many women who worked, so many, but we don't know who they are and we can't find their records, which is very sad. It's one of the things I regret, that I tried my best to piece these people together, usually through their husbands or records, scientific records, but they've kind of disappeared. We need to revive them.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. That's a shame. So we've been focusing a lot about sort of the history of silk, the background of silk, but your book also gives us a glimpse into silk's role in the future. And you've mentioned it too in our conversation, that silk will be critical in technical, medical, environmental breakthroughs. Can you talk about a particular innovation that was important for you to capture, or is important for you to capture, and a little bit more about why?
This is really interesting because I started thinking about medical. I studied cancer genetics, and I come from a medical, sort of biomedical background. But I was quite surprised when I started speaking to the scientists who work with silk now, who have silk labs, because they told me about the things they are working on in terms of surgery, because what you ask for, you hear, right? So I was asking them about these surgical and medical applications. And so there's Fiorenzo Omenetto, Professor Omenetto at Tufts University in Boston, who runs Silk Lab. And he talked about this is things they've already done. We saw how important during COVID it was to have vaccines that didn't go off. So they've had temperature stabilized vaccine using silk, also penicillin that has been stabilized, and functional chemotherapy drugs for over a decade at the Mayo Clinic. They've also got a treatment for vocal cord damage, so vocal cord paralysis, where he says, people walk into surgery, they have a silk-based implant, and they walk out being able to speak. People are working on replacements for cartilage and bone. because at the moment you implant metal into you, don't you? But silk remembers a natural animal protein, and the kind of route that they're taking is also to be able to tell that silk. If you 3D print a silk scaffold, you can tell it when to self-destruct, and then your own cells can repopulate that and build back your body rather than having something put in. Also, they're making implantable, dissolvable nuts, gears, and bolts for surgery. So there's all of that. But then I started, I just said to all of the scientists, said, so what really excites you? And I didn't expect this to be the answer, but it's really environmental damage. For Fiorenzo, also for people like Professor Fritz Vollrath at the University of Oxford, who worked with spider silk, but also the silk of nearly anything. Fritz was saying, we are so dependent on hydrocarbons, or the bloody hydrocarbons, and he said, we have to get away from it. It's kind of unconscionable. The thing about hydrocarbons and plastics, we're really good at making plastics, right? And we've had 100 years of being able to make plastics. So silk is, you can make a biopolymer. So it's something, we understand how to make plastics. And now we can go ahead and use a natural, sustainable, biodegradable material to make that. And, it's a no-brainer to make sort of silk plastic cups and bags. But something that Fiorenzo is working at Tufts University, because he's an electronic engineer originally. Electronic waste is probably more pernicious than plastic waste, because look how much of it there is, and where does it go when we're finished with our phones and all our devices. And he's working on silk electronics, and he says, the fact that we start from a naturally based material drives them to put tech where tech doesn't normally go, and that brings biology and technology together. And by that he means making human electronic interfaces. So that's, imagine biodegradable implantable electronics that record health signals or vital signals, edible consumable sensors for food waste, for example. But I should say, contextualizing it, I did talk about the material being old and used for strings and jewelry. It's still used like that, or textiles. That's always been true, and it's, I guess, not that exciting. But if we think about the fact that silk has been used for surgical sutures in ancient India and ancient Greece, they knew it had properties. So I should say that this Bombyx mori, but any silk moth that makes a silk, the reason they do it is this. So the system of development of these insects is called complete metamorphosis. And that means that they start life as a little larva that looks nothing like the adult form. So how do they get there? They start as little larvae, they hatch out of eggs, they eat copious amounts of white mulberry leaves, that's their favorite food, and they get fatter and fatter, and they get really juicy, and they get about 3 inches long, and then they stop moving and they stop eating. And that's really dangerous if you're a juicy little insect, right? So that's when they start excreting this silk liquid that's made in their body through glands and emerges through their salivary glands, and they start spinning a cocoon. And that cocoon protects them while they develop. That cocoon is about 2 kilometers, not sure what that is in miles, of continuous thread, and it hardens. So it protects them from predators, but it also has properties that protects it from pathogens. So it has properties that can help it be antibacterial and antifungal. And so people probably observed this and knew this, because why in the ancient world were they using it for surgery? In one of the Shakespearean plays, they talk about using a spider web to patch wounds with. Genghis Khan standard issue all of his soldiers with an undershirt made of thickly, tightly woven silk. And that was to protect against arrows, the damage that arrows cause, but also because there's a natural protein it can meld with the wound. And then in the Wild West, people noticed that silk had bulletproof properties, whereas your felt hat and your denim jacket and your metal headband wasn't protecting you. The silk would not be damaged when a bullet hit it. There was a priest in 19th century Chicago, Polish priest, and he made body armor that apparently the King of England and Germany had, but Archduke Franz Ferdinand was supposed to have had one, but neither he or his wife were obviously wearing it. But in 2014, the Royal British Armouries did a test of they made it to his patent, and they used the bullets that the assassin would have used, and it stopped the bullets from penetrating. So people always knew that it had technological application. So this is now the next stage, and the next stage is, I think, protecting our planet with it, which seems a very important and sensible route to go. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. So we're almost wrapping up, but I do want to get this question in. You mentioned at the beginning of our talk that you've always been fascinated by the fabric. So we know that your interest is personal, and I wanted us to just wrap up with hearing more about what actually drew you to the research and writing about silk.
I think everything I write, it's about changing perspectives. So my first book was about the future of reproduction. And, I was thinking, what is a parent? Why do we think that there's only one way to do things? Why can't two fathers be parents or two mothers? And being that science and technology is going to give us the potential through stem cells to have all sorts of biological futures, we need to think in different ways. And I think in a similar way with silk, there was only one perspective when I came to it. There was only one road. There was only one place it came from. There's only one type of silk. And from what I found out, I went on a journey, I think, with the reader. I've gone on this journey. And I've realized something really interesting. Looking at diversity and understanding different ways, different knowledges, and different the diversity of the animals that produce silk and the way people have used them is very important in the future of looking at technology for environment and sustainability, because this is not about what happens in European or American scientific bubbles. These animals that make silk are distributed in the wild around the world. And that gives a great potential for people to create and innovate and use that technology for the future, wherever they are, and with whatever knowledge system that they have. So I think that's really why I came to it as a topic. And it's been a fascinating journey.
Absolutely. I have to say it has been fascinating. I too went on a journey, as I'm sure all your readers will. And I loved your phrase about sort of embarking on the journey to change perspectives. I would say probably 9 out of 10 folks would not actually know or understand what you taught us, which is the future potential of silk, the future potential in all of the fields that you mentioned. So thank you. And just super quick last question: what is next for you? What are other areas that you're thinking of exploring or have started exploring?
Writing a new book, which is about a part of the female anatomy, and again, it's going to bring together archaeology and anthropology and history and science and futures, because I feel like, again, this is something that we all think we know, but we really don't.
I can't wait. I can't wait to read it. Dr. Aarathi, thank you so much for joining us today. And for our audience, please, I would love to encourage you to buy this book. It's amazing, wherever books are sold. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Aarathi. Appreciate it.